Hey, church family. So, once again, checking in from Whitaker headquarters. The office staff are working from home right now, so this is home base. I just wanted to share a little bit with you as we're getting ready for the sermon on Sunday. There were some thoughts that I thought might be better spun off as a little bit of a devotional, a little bit of a history lesson. So, most of you have probably heard me throw the phrase around the church has survived plagues and pandemics before. And it's something that I usually include on lists of here are all the crazy things the church has survived in the past. But we haven't actually gone into what we mean by that. So today we're going to unpack a little bit of the history of Christianity and some of the crazy things that happen during pandemics. So one of my primary resources for this is this neat little book called The Rise of Christianity, which I don't know if this is backwards to you all, because I'm on selfie view, but it's The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. And what it does is it takes a hard historical and sociological look at why early Christianity made it. And if you think about it, from a historical perspective, it really doesn't make sense. Here is this tiny little movement starting off spinning out of a minority religion of a minority people who are oppressed and persecuted by their government. This is a period of time where literally walking is the fastest means of travel. Most people are illiterate. How in the world does the gospel manage to spread? And not just spread, but it survives and thrives and it ends up everywhere. So what makes that happen? Well, actually, one of the very surprising and appropriate things you find as you look into this is that disease and pandemics were actually a really big driver of early church growth. And in fact, there's two major pandemics that sweep across Rome between about 100 and 300 AD. Just two sweeping massive plagues. So the first was called the Antonine plagues, or sometimes called the Plague of Galen. And it happened between 165 and 180. And we don't have like a hard scientific understanding of what exactly this was, but based on how it affected people, the number of people affected, and using some sort of sciencey models, modern epidemiologists think that it was probably something like measles or smallpox. Then again, less than a century later, something else happens very similar, and it spreads throughout the empire. So in this time, these diseases were entirely new. So there was no treatment, there was no immunity. Everyone's packed in, conditions are very poor. So this spreads rapidly. It affects some 20 million people. And that's not 20 million people today. That's 20 million people almost 2,000 years ago. That was a massive chunk of the world. And it killed nearly 1 in 4. 1 in 4 of 20 million. So you can imagine, this just rocks the foundations of the ancient world. And it's not just the economics, it's not just the politics, but actually the theological and philosophical foundations of the world started shaking and coming apart. So they just didn't know how to deal with this. The priests and the philosophers both were like, oh. And people weren't okay with that. So even Galen, who is one of the most famous doctors who ever lived, literally from the time he lived in this time frame to about the 16th century, he was still the authority on medical everything. They were literally translating and passing down his work year after year after year, decades, centuries. And so Galen is our best record of this period, but actually it's kind of incomplete because he took the classic Roman approach to plague and he ran for the hills. He abandoned Rome, took some of his retinue, and went back to Asia Minor, which is what we now call Turkey, and basically hung out in the hills until it all passed. So during the same period, and despite active persecution, somehow Christianity spreads rapidly. I mean, just at an insane pace. And it doesn't make any sense at all. You would think that between persecution and disease, Christianity would be shrinking, it would be struggling. But instead, as Stark points out, there's two big factors that actually drive Christianity during this plague. So the first, and a very practical level, is that Christians were actually better at dealing with the plague than their Roman neighbors. Now, as we already said, the Roman sentiment for this kind of situation was head for the hills. They literally would leave their sick and dying friends, family, and neighbors lying in the street, and they'd cart off to wherever they could get to. But instead, Christians, because of their commitment to their neighbors and showing the love of God to them, they actually cared for and served the sick and the dying, even knowing it might cost them their lives. I want to read us a little clip here. This is Dionysius of Alexandria, who was an early church leader, and he said this about it. Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and caring others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner, a number of presbyters, deacons, and laymen, winning high commendation, so that death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom. Cyprian, who was another early church leader, writing in kind of the same time period, had this to say. Finding my page here. Here we go. How suitable, how necessary it is that this plague and pestilence, which seems horrible and deadly, searches out the justice of each and every one, and examines the minds of the human race, whether the well care for the sick, whether relatives dutifully love their kinsmen as they should, whether masters show compassion for their ailing slaves, whether physicians do not desert the afflicted. Although this mortality has contributed nothing else, it has especially accomplished this for Christians and servants of God, that we have begun gladly to seek martyrdom while we are learning not to fear death. These are trying exercises for us, not deaths. They give to the mind the glory of fortitude. By contempt of death, they prepare for the crown. So, amazingly, this very basic level of care that Christians showed for their neighbors actually kept people alive. It changed the mortality rate from this massive, staggering 1 in 4 down to more like 1 in 10. So many Christians ended up dying in the process, but many more lived, and they lived because of their neighbors. These people who were saved through this, they were transformed by this kindness and grace. They saw self-sacrificial love in a real, powerful, tangible way. So this causes this shockwave religious demographic change. So before this, Christians are more like 1 in 10 from Christians to pagans. By the time this is over, it's 1 to 4. So several things kind of come together for this. One, more Christians survive because they were caring for one another. 2, their neighbors, their non-Christian friends, family, acquaintances, they survived at a higher rate, and they saw Christians caring for them. And at the same time, in the places where Christians weren't, where they weren't caring for people, the incredibly high mortality rate was actually shrinking the population. So this totally flips the board on early Christianity. So the second reason Christianity grows during this is that these kinds of situations are a time where people really wrestle with morality and meaning and mortality. Why does this happen? What's going on? The priests and the philosophers of Rome, they didn't really have an answer. Their theology wasn't made for this. And there's one really big difference in Christianity that makes this work. It's not really some kind of secret mystery. It's Jesus. It's resurrection. Christianity admits death and suffering, things going wrong as part of the human story. It assumes that in this life we're going to face difficult things. Things are going to be painful. Things might even be final in a sense. But the Christian story doesn't end there. Even though we face trial and pain and suffering and even the threat of death, we know that on the other side of that is resurrection. We have the example of Christ. We have the example of the empty tomb. We understand that death is not going to end the story. Beyond the cross is resurrection. We can have hope. We can keep the faith even when there's calamity and craziness, even when we don't know what's going on. We understand that Jesus is still in control. We understand that God is still in control of the world. So, what are our takeaways from all this? Well, please don't run out and break isolation and quarantine. That is not what we're asking for. But at the same time, this is when we can show love and care for our neighbors. Maybe for some folks that just means staying home. You are showing love and care by making sure that you don't give the disease to someone who's going to suffer and die from it. It's also a chance to care for one another, to care for our neighbors. You don't have to show up in person. Make a phone call, send a text message, shoot an email. Make sure that you're keeping up with the people around you and letting them know that you care about them, even when things are crazy. But we have opportunities beyond that. This is just as much a time of chaos and uncertainty as it was back in the day. And the way in which we care for one another, the way in which we care for our community, is going to say something about who we are. The way we carry ourselves through this is going to matter. So it's easy to talk about God and love and grace when things are easy, when times are good. But now we're really being put to the test. When push comes to shove, do we really believe it? Do we act like we believe it? Do we have faith enough for the big things? Are we living the hope of resurrection or the fear of death? This is the time when we show our faith to our neighbors, to one another, and to ourselves. So I hope that gives us a little something to chew on. I just want you all to know that we're still praying for you, that even if we're outside the building, we're still the church. You can't cancel church because it's a community. It's not a building. It's not a service we go to. Wherever people are praying, wherever they're growing as disciples, that's where God's at work. So stay safe, wash your hands, and you'll look forward to hearing from us the rest of the week. Signing out.